This is Katrin with Disability Rights New York. Welcome to our podcast, Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned. We are here to bring you information on the most relevant topics regarding disability rights and advocacy. Today, we welcome Erica Molina, the CAP and PABSS Program Director at Disability Rights New York. And we'll be talking about the Paralympic Games, specifically concerning three-time gold medalist winner Becca Meyers and her decision not to go to Tokyo to compete due to the denial of her reasonable accommodation request. Erica, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm very glad to be here and discussing these topics, Katrin. Thanks for having me.
Well, today we're talking about the Paralympic Games. They're taking place in Tokyo this year, and there have been a lot of reasons why this year's games have been different, specifically that the games are being held in a post-lockdown fashion. However, COVID-19 is still a concern, and many conditions have been set in order to attempt to have the games continue safely. And while these precautions for safety certainly need to be taken, I think some of the decisions that have been made have negatively impacted the athletes. And specifically, we're talking about Becca Meyers. Becca's a three-time gold medal athlete, and she is both deaf and blind. Becca had to make the gut-wrenching decision to drop out of the games because the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee refused her request to bring her personal care assistant with her, who also happens to be her mother. Erica, let's talk about what a personal care assistant is, and we'll talk about this refusal by the committee in terms of an accommodation under the ADA.
Sure, Katrin. A personal care assistant, or something often referred to in writing as a PCA, is someone who helps someone else with a disability get around their home, get around their daily activities, basically do what they need to do to be sure that, they live otherwise very independent, very fruitful lives. In this case, as you said, the athlete's mom acts as her PCA, a personal care attendant. And as I understand from the articles that have been written about this particular story and its aftermath, this particular athlete was pointing out the fact that there is already a PCA on the Paralympic team who was prepped in this post-pandemic environment to tend to the team as a whole. And I believe, if the sources are correct online, that this particular PCA would have had to tend to at least 33 athletes. So that personal attention and those personal needs, you would guess, in a group that large, would kind of go by the wayside. My understanding is that of those 33, 9 of the athletes are actually blind, just like this particular athlete is. So that's what a PCA is. That's what they do. And also, it's not unusual for a parent to act as their child's or even adult child's personal care attendant. So in this case, it wouldn't have been unusual to have the mom probably join in a much more normal environment. But as you said, we are in post-pandemic, and some of those policies really do seem to be interfering with some of the decisions that some of the athletes are making these days.
I think that's a great distinction where you let us know that if the PCA or personal care assistant is there for the team, that really doesn't seem too personal if the one assistant is there to help and assist 33 other athletes. I don't know how personal that could possibly be. And so when we're thinking about Becca's request for her personal care assistant, I think about all of the other accommodations that are made and maybe aren't necessarily thought of as accommodations when we're talking about other athletes, whether it's their specific dietary needs or a specific piece of equipment that they need. It doesn't seem that a personal care assistant is any different than that. This is something that the athlete needs and that it's essential to their performance. Erica, can we talk about how these things are similar and how maybe they aren't necessarily thought of? A personal care assistant isn't thought of in the traditional sense as being essential, like equipment or diet?
Absolutely. I think it's interesting that the PCA in this case, in Becca's case in particular, is seen as perhaps an extra request or something on top of or in addition to what already is being offered to the athletes, when in fact it is so essential. The fact is that this particular athlete, Becca, she is both blind and deaf. And the fact also is that Tokyo and Japan is a different place than that which she is used to being, just like any of the other American athletes who live in American soil. Once you get to Tokyo, once you get somewhere else in Japan, the Olympic Village, etc., you do have to be oriented, right, to where you need to go, where are the bedrooms, where are the cafeterias, where's the pool to practice in, where's the gym equipment, etc. And the thing about it is that if we think about perhaps the non-disabled athletes, right, that in particular, when we're talking about the Olympics and Olympic athletes, they don't need perhaps that level of support. They can be pointed in the right direction and get to another building without a problem. They can be supported in some way to ensure that they're not only going to the right place, but they're in a place where the exercise equipment is accessible. They can get in and out of the pool. They can do things basically more physically independent, more often than not, than some of the Paralympians or some of the Olympians with disabilities. So in this case, it is interesting that the request for the athlete to have brought her mom as her assistant seemed so extra, seemed so on top of everything else, when in fact it is essential that it is quite literally a foreign environment, and one which a person with both deafness and blindness, you need help getting around. And to our previous point, you need some individualized attention in order to do that safely. So you're right. The fact is that it's not viewed as a very essential service or accommodation. And it's kind of something that folks are otherwise not supposed to take for granted because it seems above and beyond when looked through a different lens.
Unfortunately, there has been some news of other athletes that are, I should say, I've only seen one where another athlete has said that this is really a matter of this being a diva moment. And that seems like it's part of the culture around sports that is perpetuated, whether it's in the movies or in media, that there's this no pain, no gain approach that you need to tough it out. You need to just roll with the punches. And that makes you a better athlete. And that really does not seem to be the case here. The idea that Becca is not having her personal care assistant accompanying her is just something that she needs to tough out. We talk about this idea that's perpetuated when we're talking about elite athletes. And Becca Meyers is, in fact, an elite 3-time gold medal winning athlete. Let's talk about how an accommodation is not anything that anyone should just have to deal with or tough out, or that by requesting what they need is somehow being a diva or someone who's looking for more than anyone else is getting.
So yeah, Catherine, it is important, I think, to make sure that we give everybody, space to say where they're coming from and what their piece is. But in particular, this was interesting because, as you said, this particular athlete who was also a Paralympian, was pointing out his view that this was an above and beyond request, that this is something that a lack of accommodation is something that he's dealt with and that others have dealt with as well. And absolutely, his position is suck it up. The rest of us have had to do without for a very long time in many different ways. And the fact that this particular athlete is calling out Becca is interesting because, first of all, we were already talking about individualized services and individualized needs, right? So Becca Meyers, for example, deaf and blind. When we see this particular other Paralympian talking about the situation here, his impairments, I believe, are limb related and more physically related. And so it's interesting that he kind of puts both of themselves on the same level, or at least on the same field, so to speak, when it comes to what needs they can do without and what needs they do need to be fulfilled as accommodations. So first of all, I think it's out of place for someone with a different set of needs, different types of disabilities, to say what someone else with differing disabilities can do with or without. So that, I believe, is a bit of overreaching, and perhaps someone wanting to become a bit more involved in the discussion than he would have been otherwise. And in addition to that, I saw the article that we're kind of alluding to, and the fact is that he did really emphasize the suck it up and get through it mentality that athletes are so familiar with, and that we're familiar with projecting onto athletes, right? Athletes, both disabled or otherwise, are seen as this type of inspirational or motivational source for lots of people. The one who pulls in at the end and pulls a win out of nowhere, someone who's just gone through a tragedy and again pulls a win out of nowhere, and things like that encourage the rest of us who perhaps don't practice any particular sport or don't consider ourselves athletes. It does a lot for us. But at the end of the day, when we're considering any athlete, they are first and foremost a person. And to accept or to continually accept the premise that all athletes have to push through. You don't take breaks, you don't slow down, you don't ask for help when you need it. That sort of mentality, I think, is on its way to being the exception and not so much the rule. There are lots of things that are telling us in today's environment that mental health is key. Accommodations for people with disabilities are essential. They're not favors. Access is crucial for everyone and anyone. And the fact is that this other athlete seems to just be buying into the suck it up and get through it mentality. But I think that I really do believe, actually, and personally hope that sort of mentality is on its way out. It's so crucial that we pay attention to what our needs are, that we're not afraid to ask for them. And quite honestly, in those cases where we're entitled to something such as a reasonable accommodation, speaking up and asking for it when we need it.
Eric, I agree with you. I do think that we are seeing some really great movement towards this ideology being moved to the back and moved to the past, so that this is something that we'll be looking forward to having these types of requests and accommodations, and no longer thinking about this type of mindset as it will be outdated. We will be looking at athletes and certainly people in general, I would hope, as a whole person, as opposed to whatever it is that they're striving for and that we think that they should be persevering through. So, outdated models of how to view athletes and this, suck it up mentality is something that we hope will become outdated. And as we finish up this podcast, there's another issue in the Olympics that is outdated as well. And this is on the heels of the pay gap that has been addressed for the very first time in US history. Paralympians will receive the same prize money per medal as Olympians. And this is something that clearly is outdated, with the first Paralympics being held in Rome in 1960. Here we are 61 years later, and this pay change is happening now. And the 2018 athletes were retroactively compensated. However, this is the first time that pay is going to be equal at the start. Erica, let's just talk about this as an outdated issue. However, we still have a pay gap, not only with Olympians and Paralympics, but in general terms. How are we looking as far as moving forward towards pay equity within these communities?
Katrin, it's such an interesting thing to point out that these remedies, I'll call them, are really only taking place right now. So you're absolutely right that this is only the first time where these athletes are going to be paid same as their non-disabled peers, and at the same time. So I will point out that it is a reflection of society as a whole that these Paralympians were paid less in the first place. And what I mean by that is that when it comes to people with disabilities, I'll point out, first of all, that there is a pay gap going on in the employment field right now. There is a pay gap between folks who have disabilities and those who don't have disabilities in terms of their employment rate and their pay. So these gaps are real and they do exist just in the regular employment and economy. When it comes to pay specifically with regards to these athletes, the Paralympians, the fact is that the lesser pay, which I believe was just about a quarter on the dollar as compared to the non-disabled athletes, that low pay really is reflective of the value that our society places on people with disabilities as a whole. And by that, I mean that there is this, whether people notice it or not, there are rules and policies and practices in place, such as this quarter on the dollar payment for one set of a population versus another, simply because they are differently abled, right? They have different abilities and disabilities on the one end, perhaps not disabilities on the other. The fact is that they are seen differently, they are treated differently. And unfortunately, that difference leads many folks in the field to think of para athletes, para Olympians as less than or as contributing less than because of the fact that they have disabilities and the fact that everybody in their particular sport has certain disabilities. So whether it is having fewer limbs, not having their eyesight, folks who have to play seated volleyball as opposed to, mainstream volleyball where you're standing and jumping around, these sports are viewed by the mainstream as less than, as different. And it is unfortunate that it is such a blatant, it's not even covert, it's not even under the radar. It's your check will be smaller than everybody else in that group simply because you play a different sport that is not mainstream and is not with that other group. The fact that you're relegated to the Paralympics means that you're automatically less than. It's absolutely wrong. And I think that, again, kind of with the tough it out or get out mentality and philosophy, I'm really hoping that acceptance and respect is going to be the new norm going forward. I am very pleased to have heard that the Paralympians are being paid the same this year. And folks need to realize that it is expensive to be an athlete full time, and in many cases, more so expensive to be a Paralympian. Folks who have to pay out of pocket for adaptive equipment, whether it is prosthetic limbs that are sports appropriate, adaptive wheelchairs, just adaptive equipment. There are many expenses that go along with being a Paralympian, in addition to just the run-of-the-mill gym hours and practice hours and pool hours and things of that nature. So folks need to realize that these folks are being paid or were being paid less at the end for their reward when they perhaps out of pocket put out a lot more than the typical non-disabled athlete. So I am glad that things are changing. I'm glad that we're talking about it. And it is important that some people who may not have even realized this disparity in athlete pay, super important for folks to learn about it and where it came from and why it no longer is.
I couldn't agree more, Erica. And I was very pleased to see the article that the nearly 400% increase was made in order to have pay equity with the Paralympians and the Olympians. And hopefully we'll see more forward movement on some of the other issues we discussed. Thank you so much for talking with us. And I look forward to talking with you again.
Thanks so much for having me, Katrin. It really was a pleasure talking about all these topics today.
All of the articles that we talked about, we will have listed in the description of the podcast.
Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned has been brought to you by Disability Rights New York, your source for disability rights and advocacy. If you enjoyed our program, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this post. If there is a subject you would like us to discuss, please email podcast@drny.org or comment below. Tune in next Wednesday, where we'll bring you more information on disability rights in the state of New York. The closed captioned and ASL version of this podcast is available on our YouTube channel. To listen to more Empire State of Rights closed captioned, follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.